For decades, they were Hollywood's perfect fantasy. Men who could ride off into the sunset with steely eyes and kiss their leading ladies like it was real. Women who were diamond-clad, untouchable in the spotlight. But off-screen, their true loves lived in the shadows, hidden by studio contracts, fake relationships, and the fear that one photo could end it all. In this video, we take you deep into Hollywood's darkest backstage corners, where 10 stars guarded the greatest secret of their lives, until the day they went to their grave. Burt Lancaster, the masculine icon and the secret behind the infamous third dressing room at the Paramount lot. To millions, he was the man every woman desired and every man envied. A towering frame, squared shoulders like a soldier, eyes that could hold a scene in silence, and a smile sharp enough to stop a heartbeat. On screen, Burt Lancaster was untouchable. Off-screen, according to some accounts, he lived in a world of closed doors and unspoken rules. Hollywood in the early 1950s was a place where contracts didn't just control the films you made, they reportedly dictated the life you were allowed to live. If your image sold tickets, the studio might decide your clothes, your companions, and above all, who you could love. It was in the summer of 1952, as From Here to Eternity prepared for production, that whispers began to circle about the infamous third dressing room at the Paramount lot. To most, it was just another room, but to some members of the late-night crew, it became legend. When filming reportedly ran past midnight, the heavy oak door would click shut from the inside. A warm amber glow seeped from beneath the frame, and the hallway filled with the slow hum of a jazz record turning. Burt arrived first, measured, deliberate steps. Minutes later came James Marlowe, a young Broadway dancer with lightning in his eyes and a smile like fire. Once the door closed, no one entered. No one dared to knock. A veteran makeup artist, decades later, recalled with a faint smile, "If the door was locked and the music was still playing, the night wasn't over yet." Their connection was never spoken aloud, but it didn't remain invisible. In 1993, a declassified FBI memo reportedly revealed that J. Edgar Hoover himself had ordered surveillance on Burt, citing moral risks tied to exclusive gatherings at a Malibu estate, parties attended only by men, many of them fresh faces just signed with Columbia. In July 1960, Confidential magazine was said to have received an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Burt on the deck of a cruise ship in Greece, holding hands with a tanned man whose face turned slightly from the camera. On the back, in rushed handwriting, were the words, "He said we were forever. Now he won't even return my calls." The public never saw it. Just weeks later, according to some reports, the studio paid $15,000 to make the picture, and the problem disappear. Even his 23-year marriage to his wife, Norma Anderson, was described by some insiders as being built on unspoken terms. A Columbia publicist once said, "As long as the leading man image stayed perfect, it didn't matter who he loved after the cameras stopped rolling." But sometimes the mask slipped. During the filming of The Swimmer in 1968, a supporting actor allegedly made a joke about Burt's sexuality. Burt didn't laugh. He reportedly hit the man hard enough to draw blood. Police arrived in minutes. The studio's lawyers arrived faster, and the incident vanished from the record. Then came 1973. Burt was said to be ready to leave Hollywood, move to Italy, and live openly with a man he loved, a French ballet dancer. They had chosen a villa outside Florence. 2 months before the move, a car accident near Nice ended that dream in an instant. Burt withdrew from acting for 5 years. Friends said he became quieter, slower to smile, as if a part of him had been lost forever. To the public, he remained the legend, the perfect masculine ideal. But some believe the greatest role Burt Lancaster ever played was keeping the truth of his heart hidden until the day he went to his grave. Cary Grant, the man who made charm look effortless and whose off-screen life was a script no studio dared to film. To the public, Cary Grant was Hollywood elegance made flesh. A tuxedo draped over his frame as naturally as sunlight falls on the ocean. On screen, he could make danger look debonair, chasing spies across rooftops, stealing jewels with a wink, kissing his leading ladies as if the film itself might burn without him. But when the cameras stopped, there was another story. One played out in beach houses with shuttered windows, in rented villas where the guest lists were never printed, and in photographs that disappeared before the ink could dry. In the early 1930s, long before North by Northwest, Cary shared a Malibu home with fellow actor Randolph Scott. The press called it Bachelor Hall and ran photos of the two men in matching trousers, grilling steaks on the porch, lounging by the pool. Some readers saw nothing unusual. Studio executives saw a ticking clock. Behind closed doors, Paramount executives ordered a new narrative. The dashing Cary must be seen with women, actresses, heiresses, anyone photogenic enough to silence whispers. Premieres became carefully staged productions, with red carpet dates arranged days in advance. Marriage followed, brief, almost surgical, before ending without public scandal. Yet the connection between Cary and Randolph refused to vanish. Neighbors spoke of late-night lights in the beach house long after Cary had supposedly moved out. A former studio photographer once admitted that his negatives from a Palm Springs shoot vanished after a producer saw an image of the two men laughing together in a way no headline could safely explain. And then there were the disappearances. In 1954, during the filming of To Catch a Thief, Cary slipped away for 3 days. The official report, illness, but a crew member claimed he saw Cary boarding a private plane to Mexico with an unidentified man, returning before dawn on the 4th day as if nothing had happened. Cary's later years were marked by a string of short marriages and even shorter public romances. But to those who knew him well, his most genuine smiles appeared in moments far from the spotlight, sailing quietly at dusk, walking barefoot on empty beaches, or sharing breakfast in kitchens where no reporters could follow. The world remembers Cary Grant as the ultimate leading man, untouched by scandal. Yet Hollywood insiders will tell you there were reels of his life that never made it to the screen, stories locked away in drawers, guarded as tightly as the man himself. Paul Newman, the love letters never sent. Those dazzling blue eyes could freeze a room mid-breath. On screen, he was perfection, the unshakable hero, the charmer every woman dreamed of. But behind that flawless exterior was a silence so deep, few ever guessed it was there. In the summer of 1955, Newman was Hollywood's golden newcomer, all talent, beauty, and promise. But during the filming of East of Eden, something began that would never make it into any press release. James Dean, quiet, magnetic, with a gaze that seemed to look through walls, was rumored to have become more than just a co-star. They took morning walks, no one interrupted, lingered in dressing rooms long after the crew had gone home. A makeup artist caught glimpses, a manager kept a few behind-the-scenes photographs for later. Soon, a strange clause began to appear in Newman's contracts, forbidding close personal ties with male co-stars outside filming hours. Officially, it was image protection. Unofficially, everyone knew. By the early 1970s, whispers had shifted to a cabin in the Sundance Mountains of Utah. The deed listed no name, but one visitor came like clockwork: Robert Redford. Neighbors swore they saw the two men on the porch for hours, lost in conversation under autumn skies. Not ordinary friends, not strangers. Whatever it was, it lasted for decades in near total silence. Joanne Woodward, Newman's wife of over 50 years, never spoke publicly about the rumors, but one crew member from Winning remembered the day she quietly demanded a young lighting assistant be removed from the set after finding him alone with Paul in the dressing room. No drama, just one sentence to the director: "If he stays, I can't continue." And like so many Hollywood scandals, it ended before it began. In 1985, after Rock Hudson's AIDS diagnosis became public, Newman drafted notes for an interview with Barbara Walters. He was said to have intended to reveal a truth he'd guarded for decades, that he had once loved a man, and that love had changed his life. Hours before the taping, studio lawyers arrived with an image clause. The interview was canceled. No explanation. None needed. Those who worked close to Newman sometimes spoke of the toll his relentless schedule took on him. In quiet offices far from the cameras, studio medics tried to keep his exhaustion at bay. A cocktail of rest cures, night watches, and the sort of medication more often given to those battling the darkest illnesses. None of it ever reached the tabloids. His file stayed buried in locked drawers. When his belongings were cataloged after his death, an unremarkable steel box drew curiosity. Inside were a few personal notes, a handful of photographs, and several sealed envelopes signed only with initials. Old friends recognized the handwriting and understood who they were from, but no one spoke of the contents. Whatever they held, Newman had kept them private for a reason. Newman's marriage to Joanne Woodward seemed to the outside world untouchable. A union of romance and mutual respect. Few knew that the studios of the era kept a close watch on their stars' personal lives, nudging them toward partnerships that matched a marketable image. In Paul and Joanne's case, the push was unnecessary. They already had the chemistry the cameras craved. In his final year, a different kind of story made its way through whispered conversations. An off-duty meeting with a longtime friend at a roadside cafe, laughter over coffee, a hand resting briefly in a moment of quiet camaraderie. There were no staged lights, no photographers in sight, except for one whose picture was never meant for headlines. It ended up in private hands, just like so many parts of Newman's life the public never saw. Montgomery Clift, the tragedy behind the perfect face. On screen, Montgomery Clift was magnetic, the sensitive rebel, the man whose eyes seemed to carry both a promise and a warning. Director said he didn't just act, he let you see inside him. Women fell in love with him, men wanted to be him. And yet, the closer you got to the real Clift, the more you realized that charm was a kind of armor, polished to perfection, hiding a truth Hollywood could never allow. In the late 1940s, Clift arrived in Los Angeles already carrying whispers from Broadway. A few insiders knew about his private world, but the unspoken rule was simple. You can be anything you want, as long as the cameras never see it. During the filming of Red River in 1948, a young production assistant recalled an afternoon when Clift slipped away between takes with a crew member. They returned 20 minutes later, hair slightly rumpled, exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. No one asked questions. Asking could end your career. His closest bond was with theater actor Kevin McCarthy. To the public, they were old friends who shared an apartment for a time in New York. In reality, they moved through life like two halves of a secret. They went to dinners, rehearsals, and midnight jazz clubs, always arriving separately, always leaving with minutes between them. In press photos from that era, McCarthy often appears just out of focus, as if the camera knew to keep him on the edge of the frame. Elizabeth Taylor would become his most trusted confidant. She called him Monty and defended him fiercely, knowing better than most the careful dance he had to perform. In May 1956, she saved his life, pulling him from the wreckage after he crashed his car into a telephone pole just down the hill from her house. The official story blamed exhaustion, but a close friend claimed the crash happened as Clift tried to lose a car that had been following him for days. A tabloid photographer who had earlier caught him in a quiet, unmistakable moment by Taylor's pool with another man. The negatives were never seen again. The accident left his once perfect face subtly changed. On screen, makeup and lighting softened the differences, but in person, they were undeniable. Friends said something shifted in him after that night. A certain brightness gone, replaced by long silences. His drinking increased. Roles came less often. When he did work, he was still brilliant, but slower to smile, quicker to disappear once the camera stopped. In the early 1960s, neighbors in New York often saw a tall man in a dark coat leaving Clift's townhouse late at night. No one could ever identify him. Some said it was McCarthy. Others believed it was a photographer who had once tried to expose him, now turned into a strange sort of companion. On July 22, 1966, Clift's housekeeper found him in bed, gone at just 45 years old. Officially, it was a heart attack, but the nurse who'd cared for him during his final months told a journalist years later that the night before, Clift had spent hours watching The Misfits, his film with Marilyn Monroe, and reading a worn envelope. She wouldn't reveal who it was from, only that when she last saw him, he was smiling faintly at something written inside. Whatever those words were, they went with him. Another piece of Montgomery Clift's life that Hollywood would never put on screen. Greta Garbo, the woman who vanished from the screen, but not from Whispersboro. Greta Garbo was more than a star. She was an apparition. The Swedish beauty who spoke little, smiled rarely, and yet held every gaze as if she'd bewitched the entire world. On screen, she could be a queen, a courtesan, or a tragic lover. Off-screen, she was the most elusive figure in Hollywood. People called her the divine, but what she truly worshipped was her privacy. In the 1930s, Garbo's face was everywhere. Movie posters, magazine covers, newsreels. But the woman behind that image lived a life with locked doors and carefully drawn blinds. Friends said she often invited guests to her Beverly Hills home for tea at 4 p.m., only to answer the door herself in silk pajamas, hair unbrushed, speaking in a low murmur. The guest list was always small, and almost always the same. A circle of women who shared her taste for art, travel, and secrecy. Among them was Mercedes de Acosta, a playwright and socialite known for her stormy romances with some of Hollywood's most glamorous women. The two traveled together, exchanged dozens of letters, and sometimes spent weeks in Europe, far from the glare of the studios. In one surviving note, Garbo wrote, "We are alike, you and I. The world would not understand." That letter, smudged and creased from years of being folded, is now locked away in a private collection, its full contents never published. Garbo's distaste for the press became legendary. She once turned down an Oscar invitation simply by sending back the envelope unopened. She avoided interviews, refusing to explain herself to the public. But those who worked on her sets noticed subtle rebellions. A lingering touch with a female co-star during rehearsals, a coded glance to someone waiting just off stage. A cameraman from Queen Christina claimed that one close-up, Garbo gazing dreamily into the distance, was actually her looking straight at a woman standing behind the lights. By 1941, at just 36, Garbo walked away from Hollywood without warning. No farewell tour, no press statement. She boarded a ship to Sweden and left the industry in shock. Yet the most curious part wasn't her disappearance from the screen. It was the life she led after. In New York, where she eventually settled, Neighbors spoke of a tall, striking woman walking alone through Central Park in oversized coats and dark glasses. Sometimes, another woman walked beside her, their heads tilted close together in deep conversation, hands brushing briefly before parting ways. When Garbo died in 1990, her personal effects were sent to a storage facility in Manhattan. Months later, an auction catalog quietly listed a bundle of sealed envelopes, all addressed in the same looping handwriting, all marked private. The buyer was anonymous. Their contents remain a mystery. To the world, Greta Garbo will always be the woman who wanted to be alone. But to those who caught her rare, unguarded moments, she was someone else entirely. A woman who loved in shadows and carried those shadows with her until the end. Dirk Bogarde, a lifetime in silence. For decades, he was the intellectual gentleman of British cinema. The man who could fill a theater without ever raising his voice. Smooth, deliberate, perfectly pressed, and yet utterly unknowable. He lived alone, they said. Loved books, loved art, avoided scandal, never married. But there was one name the press never dared to print, and one man who never left his side. No one ever asked about Anthony Forwood, the co-star who became his constant companion. The man who traveled with him, stood beside him at every award show, and quietly managed his affairs for over 3 decades. They shared homes, holidays, and hospital rooms. Yet no article dared to call them partners. In an era obsessed with appearances, their closeness was an open secret wrapped in silence. In 1968, Bogarde signed a lucrative memoir deal with Harper & Row. He delivered a manuscript unlike anything the publisher expected. Over 40 pages of personal letters to Tony, along with a startling line, "I have never loved a woman, and I have never wanted to." The reaction was swift. A formal letter demanded the passages be removed to meet American moral standards, or the contract would be terminated. Bogarde withdrew the book entirely. The memoir never saw print. After his death, leaked British Library records suggested that on the day of his funeral, a cousin flew to France to collect every diary, letter, and photograph he had ever shared with Tony. The collection was locked away indefinitely, with legal threats hanging over anyone who tried to publish its contents. Only one fragment escaped, a note secretly photographed by a gardener. The handwriting trembled. "Tony loved me without asking me to say it aloud. I played 60 straight men on screen, and the world believed it. But when I held his hand in that hospital room, just once, I felt real." Etienne the gardener remembered seeing Bogarde one evening beneath the balcony, clutching a letter from Tony's chemo ward. The actor wept openly, crying in French, "How can I not love the one who's dying, simply because he's not a woman?" In 1985, the British government quietly considered him for a knighthood. According to a Guardian leak decades later, the recommendation was delayed after officials noted his long-term intimate relationship with a male companion of undefined legal status. The honor never came. When Tony died in 1988, Bogarde personally arranged the cremation and kept his ashes in a drawer for 11 years. Every morning, their housekeeper recalled, he'd open the study, glance at the drawer, and whisper, "Bonjour, mon cœur." Good morning, my heart. When Bogarde himself passed in 1999, his funeral included no mention of Tony. Not a single photograph of him was displayed. Yet on Bogarde's desk was a scrap of paper, the sentence unfinished. "The only role I truly acted was when I cooked dinner for Tony." Somewhere at Oxford University, in a drawer marked number 17, sits a sealed manuscript believed to be his final work. Its title reads, "Let me say his name once." No one has been allowed to read it. Barbara Stanwyck, the woman Hollywood called untouchable. On screen, she could be anyone. The quick-witted girl from the wrong side of the tracks, the icy femme fatale who could destroy a man with a glance, or the perfect wife every man dreamed of coming home to. Her eyes could go from warm to lethal in a single frame, and audiences couldn't look away. Off-screen, she lived by one rule: never give them more than they paid for. She rarely gave interviews, avoided public gossip, and kept her personal life behind locked doors. Reporters loved to call her fiercely independent, but there was one subject she never addressed at all. In the 1930s, quiet rumors swirled about a certain actress and her unusually close friendship with a celebrated Broadway leading lady. The two were said to have spent months traveling together, well after their stage collaboration had ended. In an era when a single whisper could shatter a career, they appeared in public just often enough to be noticed, yet never long enough to invite direct questions. By the 1940s, Barbara's name was quietly tied to several women in the industry: costumers, script supervisors, even one MGM publicist, but never in print. Studio executives had a way of keeping it that way. An MGM photographer once claimed he had developed a series of candid shots showing Barbara sitting on a blanket in Griffith Park, her hand resting over another woman's in a way no one could mistake. The negatives were destroyed before the day was over. Her marriage to actor Robert Taylor, MGM's golden boy, was a photographer's dream. They were beautiful, poised, and seemingly perfect. But insiders knew it was more of a mutually beneficial arrangement. He kept his own private life off the record, and she avoided scrutiny about hers. When they divorced in 1951, Taylor never spoke a word against her. In the early 1960s, Barbara bought a secluded ranch in the San Fernando Valley, far from the gossip of the Hollywood Hills. Neighbors noticed a housekeeper who seemed far too young to have spent decades cleaning houses, yet was always at Barbara's side, gardening, riding horses, traveling to New York for weeks at a time. When asked about her in an interview, Barbara only smiled and said, "Some people make a house clean, some people make it a home." There were also persistent stories from Paramount crew members who worked with her in the late 1930s. They remembered a locked dressing room door, the faint scent of cigarette smoke, and laughter muffled through the walls, always with the same woman visiting, always slipping away before the crew returned. One prop master claimed he once found a note tucked inside a costume pocket reading simply, "See you at midnight." Same place. The handwriting was Barbara's. In her later years, she became a powerhouse on television, commanding respect in every room she entered. But even then, the walls around her private life never lowered. When she passed away in 1990, her will named the housekeeper as the sole heir to her personal estate, along with an unusual handwritten note, "You were the reason I always came home." Anthony Perkins, the man who could make fear look beautiful. To the world, he would always be Norman Bates, the polite, boyish motel clerk whose smile could curdle into something sinister. But behind that shy half-grin, Anthony carried a secret life more fragile and far more dangerous than any role he ever played. He arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1950s, all nervous charm and awkward elegance, the kind of actor who could blush on cue. He didn't drink, he didn't party, but he did disappear, sometimes for days without explanation. Studio publicists invented excuses. He's working on a script. He's visiting family. The truth was far harder to fit into a press release. During his early Broadway days, Anthony had fallen into a quiet romance with actor Tab Hunter. They met at a small industry dinner, and for nearly 2 years they shared late-night drives along the Pacific Coast Highway, music low, headlights cutting through the mist. Friends recalled Anthony's posture changing when Tab walked into a room, shoulders softening, eyes locking, like no one else was there. But when Confidential magazine began hinting at an exposé, Paramount stepped in. Within weeks, Perkins was suddenly seen escorting starlets to premieres. All smiles for the flashbulbs. The relationship ended without a word. By the 1960s, his career was at full speed. Hitchcock had made him an icon, but fame only tightened the walls around his private life. Cast and crew from Psycho later admitted they never saw Anthony with a female co-star off set, but they did notice the same young screenwriter visiting his bungalow every Friday night, leaving only after sunrise. One grip remembered walking past and hearing the sound of a piano playing softly inside, Anthony's hands moving over the keys while a low voice hummed along. He was meticulous about avoiding evidence. No photographs, no letters, no loose words. Even close friends rarely heard him speak about love, except for one moment during the filming of Goodbye Again in Paris. Over dinner with director Anatole Litvak, Anthony reportedly stared at the Seine for a long time before saying quietly, "You can't imagine how much of my life is pretend." In the late 1970s, after years of living alone in New York, Anthony began a relationship with dancer-choreographer Grover Dale. By then, the press had shifted to newer scandals, and their partnership existed in a rare pocket of privacy. Still, Anthony avoided any public acknowledgement, even when Dale stayed with him through illness. When Anthony Perkins died in 1992 from AIDS-related complications, his public statement, dictated just weeks earlier, made no mention of lovers, male or female. But a private hospital nurse later told Vanity Fair she found a folded piece of sheet music in his bedside drawer. Across the top, in Anthony's looping handwriting, were the words, "For the one who kept me alive between the lines." Ramon Novarro, Hollywood's first Latin lover, and the mystery that lingered long after the cameras stopped. In the 1920s, his name alone could fill theaters. Perfectly sculpted features, eyes that smoldered with quiet intensity, and a charm that made him the studio's golden bet for romance. To the public, he was the exotic gentleman every woman dreamed of. Off-screen, his life followed a very different script, one the studios worked tirelessly to keep locked away. He never married. Magazines called him too devoted to his craft, or still searching for the right girl. But those close to him whispered of midnight visitors, unlisted phone numbers, and a small leather address book kept locked inside his desk. A housekeeper who worked for him in the 1930s once claimed she had seen a page of it by accident. Names written in his neat hand. Men from every corner of the industry. Studio assistants, chorus boys, young actors on the verge of fame. In his prime, Novarro was careful. No public displays, no photographs that couldn't be explained away. One Paramount photographer would later confess that a roll of film showing Novarro at the beach, his arm around another man, had been quietly misplaced in the studio archives within hours of being developed. It was never spoken of again. By the 1950s, his star had dimmed, but his private world stayed just as tightly guarded. His home in the Hollywood Hills became a gathering place for quiet evenings. Never more than half a dozen guests, all men, the curtains drawn before sunset. Neighbors said the nights often carried faint traces of piano music and low laughter drifting through the air, until both would stop suddenly, as if someone had remembered the need for silence. Friends would later recall him speaking more openly in his final years, though always in fragments. He hinted at a box of love letters hidden deep in a closet, from someone the world would never believe. Whether the writer was a fellow star, a man of great influence, or a figure far from Hollywood's lights, no one could say for certain. Then came the night of October 30th, 1968. The newspapers called it a robbery gone wrong, but the official reports told a more unsettling story. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, and framed photographs scattered across the floor. Many showing Novarro with unidentified men, their faces scratched out in ink. 2 young brothers were arrested and later convicted, claiming they had come looking for a hidden fortune from his Ben-Hur days. No such money was ever found. The studio made no comment. His funeral was small, attended mostly by aging co-stars and distant relatives. The leather address book disappeared without a trace. The box of letters, if it existed, was never recovered. And yet, the whispers have never faded. Some say the break-in was nothing more than a cover, that someone wanted not cash, but the erasure of whatever proof still remained of who Ramon Novarro truly loved, and how far someone was willing to go to keep that truth hidden forever. Walter Pidgeon, the leading man who never quite lived where people thought he did. On screen, he was the dependable hero, the commander, the father, the dignified gentleman who could calm a room just by standing in it. Off-screen, his life was harder to pin down. In the 1940s and 50s, Pidgeon kept an apartment in New York and a home in Beverly Hills, yet rarely slept in either. Train porters remembered him as a regular on the overnight run between the two cities, never with a large entourage, just a single leather case and an unlisted ticket bought in cash. One porter swore that the same sharply dressed man, not an actor, not a publicist, boarded with him almost every trip, and they would talk quietly until morning. Studio publicists explained his constant travel as business meetings or scouting stage plays, but the schedules never matched. He would vanish for days in small towns that had no theaters at all. Sometimes he would return to set with a small gift in his pocket, a hand-carved wooden pen, a pressed flower in a glass case, things that didn't look like souvenirs from business trips. In 1954, while filming Executive Suite, the MGM lot security log recorded him leaving at 11:43 p.m. in a green Packard sedan. The same car later spotted parked outside a modest craftsman house in Pasadena. The house belonged to a set designer who had worked on 3 of Pidgeon's earlier films. Neighbors recalled seeing the 2 men gardening together on Sunday mornings, though neither ever mentioned the other in public. Hollywood at the time was in the middle of a quiet but fierce crackdown on any gossip that could tarnish its biggest stars. The morality clauses in studio contracts were broad enough to cover almost anything the executives disapproved of, and they were enforced ruthlessly. One MGM publicist later admitted that anything about Walter that wasn't about his movies never made it to print. When gossip columnists tried to follow the Pasadena connection, they hit a wall. No photographs, no interviews, no one willing to speak on record. One reporter later claimed that her editor received a phone call from someone very high at the studio, warning her that printing anything personal about Pidgeon would mean the end of her career. By the 1960s, he had become one of MGM's most respected veterans, the sort of man younger actors went to for quiet advice. But those closest to him said that advice always came with a warning. Never let them write your whole story for you. In the late 70s, after his retirement, a private exhibition at a small gallery in Santa Barbara displayed candid portraits of classic Hollywood stars. One was labeled simply Evening Guest. It showed a man in profile, reading by lamplight in a beach house living room. Visitors whispered it looked exactly like Walter Pidgeon, older, relaxed, smiling, but the owner of the photograph refused to confirm the name. And maybe that was the point. Walter Pidgeon's legacy was built on the roles he played, and on the parts of himself that no one was ever allowed to see. Under the dazzling lights of Hollywood, they were cinematic icons, idols worshipped by millions. But behind the smiles and roaring applause, they were stars forced to hide their true selves as gay men or women, all the way to the day they died. Not because they were ashamed, but because the system never allowed them to be who they truly were. So, what do you think? How many other stars lived behind that glamorous mask? And when will the truth finally be given its rightful place? Leave a comment below and tell us which story from today's video stayed with you the most. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next shocking tales from behind Hollywood's closed doors.